Hello, this is Georgina Rose, and welcome back to the Doctor on the YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, esotericism, religion, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've brushed on a little bit in other videos, but have never made a full deep dive into, and it's really about a common association people have. So, in normal culture and in academic discussions and honestly the whole internet, really everywhere new pagan, neo-pagan movements come up, there is an association between paganism and witchcraft and a strong connection between the two. But I wanted to look into, where does this come from? Are these things really the same? What is the history that has connected them? And is this connection really a good thing? Because this connection has been made so extensively in the modern mind that I think we should unpack it, because there are people who really do say they are the same thing who are in the community. There are people who use it interchangeably, and at times I have been guilty of using these terms somewhat interchangeably. However, there are also people in the community who really hate this association, that get very upset about it. Especially pagan reconstructionists get really upset about it. So let's get into the topic. So I'd like to start with a common phrase that is used online that I think sums up the general position of this conversation, and that is, paganism is a religion, witchcraft is a practice. Now, I don't know about that one. And it's something that logically makes sense, but without actually discussing what these terms mean and are, I think it's an oversimplification. Because first of all, paganism as a term is not one singular religion, right? Paganism as a term refers to a lot of different things, a lot of different movements, and they're very much not the same movement. Now, let's use the different definitions that people have given for paganism. So the word pagan originally was not a religious identifier. It was actually a term of othering. So pagan kind of meant a few things. It comes out of the Roman world, and the very first usage of it we hear is to refer to like hicks, like redneck hill people, people on the outside, basically like people in rural areas. That's obviously not a religiously loaded term. That's just kind of like a derogatory insult for like redneck mountain person, right? That's the very first historic use of the term. Now, the term starts getting associated with religion when we start talking about the Roman conversion to Christianity. So when Rome converted, obviously, the people who converted first were people in the higher stratas of society and people in urban centers. The Christian rise throughout Europe really centered on cities originally and then would progressively move to more rural areas. And so the places that were pagan, pre-Christian, the longest, were largely rural areas, right? The people who would have been called pagan before. And so that's where this association actually starts clicking into place. The last country in Europe to converted in literally, I think it was like 1300 or something, 1400, really, really late. And it was areas in Lithuania. Now, in other parts of Europe, there were pockets of pagan cults here and there, or heavily syncretic traditions. We'll see that the more rural areas of society generally, even when they went Christian, still maintained a strong folkloric and identity with a lot of things that we would call now folk magic or pagan traditions that were interwoven into Christianity. Now, where the witch thing starts coming in here is really a historical thesis. That's where we're going to see this brought in. So there was this British historian, she was Anglo-Indian, named Margaret Murray. Margaret Murray was a very popular historian and folklorist, and she very strongly believed in this theory in academia, which she did write about extensively. There's a book called The Witch Cult of Western Europe, which is her academic writing on it, called the Witch Cult Hypothesis. And the witch cult hypothesis essentially stated that there were surviving, and she was mostly writing about the British Isles, pockets of people who maintained an unfiltered, unchanged pre-Christian religion all the way up to the modern day. And they were existing in rural areas up in the, outer realm of the United Kingdom this entire time through secrecy and through lineage initiation. This was her theory. Now, that theory has so much going on with it that I want to get into it because this theory really does explicitly use the term witch to refer to pre-Christian religious survival, right? It uses this term. It calls it the witch cult. That is what they call it. And it posits that the term witchcraft kind of referred to the surviving pagan religion of these British people. So now let's talk about the term witch, because that needs to be discussed. So the term witch predates Christianity. It is not a Christian invented term. It is a term that comes from pre-Christian Europe. The exact term witch in English comes from Old Anglo-Saxon Wicca. Wicca means wise and bend, like wising and bending. So kind of what that implies etymologically is someone who has a sense of cunning, intuition. You also hear the term cunning folk used for these terms in older writing, who bends things, who changes things, who is able to make change, right? So that's where you get that magic implication going on. Now, when we look at terms that we would now align with witch, like the idea of the witch, the archetype of the witch, that is pre-Christian. But what's interesting is when we look at the pre-Christian use for this, we're gonna have to talk about the fact that magic in the ancient pagan world was not all what would be called witchcraft. And I would say the vast majority of magical practitioners in the ancient pagan world would not have embraced witchcraft or any similar term that appears, like sorcerer. There's a bunch of them. Shahir in Arabia, Sahir, strega in Italy, Rome. All these terms, they were not generally embraced by people, and they were used in a derogatory way. So when you look at Roman law, like pagan Roman, like law, we see a lot of delineations about magical practice and writing about what is licit and what is illicit. So a large term that was used in the ancient Roman world was theurgia. So theurgia means divine magic of the gods, and a lot of what we would call mysticism would fall under theurgia. Now, Goetia, and I'm sure you guys all have heard the word Goetia because the Ars Goetia, a Christian Renaissance text, does use this term. Goetia basically means non-divine magic, and so that would refer to magic using darker spirits, cursing, magic for personal gain, all of that. Now, there was a third category, magia naturalis, and magia naturalis referred to natural magic, so that would be magic using herbs, magic using the planets, any sort of planetary astrological magic, and things like the stellar cults of Haran, because there were a number of people who were really pagans that lasted far longer than the other pagans, who were star worshippers and essentially had a very cosmic theology. So those people would really all be considered magia naturalis or theurgia, and so people like that would have to be implicitly removed from the witch cult hypothesis because they were not considered witch, they were doing divine magic. And so when we talk about people who did practice Goetia, because they did exist, there were a lot of restrictions about what you could do, and a lot of practices were seen as essentially, as we would say now, black magic, whether or not you like that term. There were rules about this, and so the idea that the ancient pagan world completely allowed magic for, say, cursing or domination magic or personal gain is not correct. But these practices did exist. There's extensive records of curse tablets in Rome, extensive records of these things. And a number of the practices that would become iconic with the witch in the post-Christian era do have pagan rootings. Now, when we talk about the rise of Christianity, this term witch starts being used a lot more frequently. When we look at the Bible itself, the word used for witch in the thou shalt not allow a witch to live verse, I'm paraphrasing that, but you know the one, is veneficia. So veneficia does not literally translate as witch, nor does it literally translate as sorcerer. It actually translates as poisoner. That word translates as poisoner. And so a lot of that is talking about the connection between the witch and the poison, which was heavily known. In Europe, after Christianity really took over, a big thing that would happen with people who were called witches, and a lot of the writing about witchcraft is the heavy use of botanical poisons for various purposes, whether that is to curse people or for entheogenic use. Poison plants were heavily used. Now, let's talk about what was written about witchcraft in the post-Christian era, because really a lot of the sourcing for this is from people who were witch hunters, because those people did exist. That all happened. Now, how much of their writing can be trusted as something that happened is incredibly disputed. And I think an ironic thing about a lot of the witch cult hypothesis is it would, on some level, justify the witch hunts to some extent, because it would imply that this stuff did exist to some extent. Now, what do I think about the historical evidence for all of this? So I think there probably were a small percentage of people who, had like a witch cult, but obviously the vast majority of people persecuted in the witch hunts were not witches, and I think even the people who were witches were persecuted. It was bad. So just putting that out there. But we do know that witch as a term was used extensively, and we have court records, we have records of people who have confessed to witchcraft. How much that was under duress, I don't know. Now, there have also been people who, as time went on, have said that they were witches and come out about this themselves. There was a historian, Leland, who, according to him, he met a woman in Italy who showed him a extensive grimoire record called Aradia, and it had a complete theological mythos in it. And she claimed it was a surviving religion since before Christianity that had existed in secret in Tuscany. She was in Tuscany. Now, this text has been published by this folklorist, and what's interesting about it is, for something that claims to be untainted by Christianity, there's a heavy Christian influence on Aradia. It's pretty overt, even in some of the spirit names. Now, the claim that Leland makes is the reason why these names were used is, as Christianity rose throughout Europe, these surviving pagan witch groups, these witch cult hypothesis people, were getting called all these terms like witch, evil, whatever, to the point where they started actually kind of taking on some of these terms and seeing themselves through that lens because they were further disconnected from the pagan religion that they came from. Now, that is the most debatable statement in all of history, but it is something that was said. Now, another argument is a lot of these documents could be forged, but it's still worth discussing. Witchcraft literature from this period did heavily influence neo-pagan movements, whether you think that these texts are legitimate or are fabricated. Academia certainly argues they are fabricated. That is the academia, science, history consensus. That is what the consensus is. Now, there are people who disagree with that, and in terms of neo-pagan movements, these documents have had an incredible influence to the point where some historians have argued that they might really remain in the realm of mythology. So having all of that out there, we're starting to see this term witch in Europe associated with other beliefs, things outside of the main heterodoxy, heresy, and inherently a pagan belief set would be outside of a Christian belief set, and thus it would make sense for them to call it witchcraft, as witchcraft was a derogatory term that was thrown at a lot of different folk practices, a lot of different things, some things that literally met that definition of beneficia as seen in the Bible, and then some other things that were folk healing, local traditions, all of that. So as modern pagans, we need to reckon with this history, that there is an interlinking throughout history, but should we take that on now? How should we view that now? What does it mean for us? Now, when we look at our movement, we are talking about a neo-pagan revival that is not a continuous, unbroken tradition, especially in Western Europe and people who are in the Western European diaspora. We are not part of an unbroken lineage tradition. We are part of a revivalist movement. And so we are inherently trying to recreate a broken chain. And unless you are a member of a coven that claims a unbroken lineage, which those do exist, there are people who make this claim, there is a connection there. So let's talk about our modern movement. I think it is worth discussing Wicca, even though everyone really hates Wicca now. There are very few people who self-identify as Wiccan. Wicca has had an incredible impact and does need to be discussed whenever you discuss modern paganism, because it is the largest and most known movement amongst us. So there were a few different times when paganism came back, and it all kind of happened in the same period that I call the magical revival. That would be Edwardian, Victorian, and a little after that. Now, a lot of these movements happened around the same time. There was Theosophy, there was Wicca, there was Thelema, and there were German Reconstructionist pagan movements, and there were Perennialist movements kind of all happening at the same time. over the span of about 70, 80, 90 years. It's a long chunk of time. I've decided to extend the term magical revival outside of Victorian Edwardian because there are other movements in Europe that I do think need to be included in this conversation, such as New Thought, such as Perennialism. All of these people I do think belong properly in any real discussion of this time period. It was not just what was happening in England and the Slavic world that was relevant. There were a lot of movements coming back and a lot of paganism coming into the world, and I think this whole lump of time should be discussed because there were kind of two strains emerging from this period of time that would exist into modern paganism, and that would be the strand that comes off of Wicca and Lodge magic. That all is very linked. There was a lot of crossover in the characters involved and the people involved, and this stuff really started from a number of things, people having various experiences that they said were directly channeled from gods or spirits, and with Wicca, which is really important. This man, Gerald Gardner, claimed that he met a group of women called the New Forest Coven who initiated them into his unbroken witch tradition, and he believed this tradition was what the witch cult hypothesis of Margaret Murray, who he was incredibly inspired by, was. He also took a lot of influence from Leyland's Aradia, and that is, I really think, a lot of the god-goddess duotheism of Wicca comes from. And so he explicitly, Wicca is literally just a take on the Anglo-Saxon word for witch. So that lumps them together, and he claimed Wicca is a religion, which throws out the idea that witchcraft is a practice, not a religion. If he is correct, that throws that theory out. And if you believe in the witch cult hypothesis to any extent, you do kind of believe witchcraft is a religion. You don't actually believe it's a practice. To believe witchcraft is a practice is actually kind of a it's like an older pagan idea, right? Like these things, it's not your religion. You still believe in the Roman gods. You're just doing illicit magic, right? So that's why it's all connected now. And since Wicca, whether you love it, hate it, or want it to die, has a huge influence on this community, people have so many different problems with Wicca, and the people who really defend Wicca. I feel very complicated on Wicca. I can make I'll do an hour-long podcast on that, actually. I'll do a Wicca podcast where I get into that, because I feel so conflicted, and my criticisms of Wicca are not a lot of other people's criticisms of Wicca. Anyways, huge influence. So now you get the modern community where anyone who has any sort of Wicca influence on them whatsoever probably connects these things really heavily in their mind, because that's what Wicca did. Now, let's talk about pagan Reconstructionism, because pagan Reconstructionism started happening about the same time. Pagan Reconstructionism are movements that attempt to completely reconstruct an ancient pagan religion, typically with a heavy ancestral tie, and bring it into the modern day. There are very large Roman Reconstructionist movements. There is obviously Germanic, Nordic movements. There's a lot of them. They're probably one of the biggest groups of people, is the Nordic Reconstructionists. And there are many other Reconstructionist groups in Eastern Europe. There are a lot of Slavic pagan Reconstructionists. A lot of them are actually incredibly powerful and have a lot of sway. There's a huge population of pagan Reconstructionists in Ukraine in particular. They're big. And these movements do not use the term witch. Overwhelmingly, they do not use the term witch. They don't like it, and they don't like this association, because since they are trying to recreate the ancient world, and in the ancient world, the word witch was not really used positively, they do not want to be called witch. And any magic that descends from their tradition, they tend to use the ancient terms for those magic. So Roman pagans will use the term theurgy. They will say they are theurgist. People who are into Nordic paganism will say they do galder, or specific practices like runic magic, all of that. They'll really reconstruct specific things. And so these people don't like this association because they see witch as, and what's so interesting, largely they often will say witch is a post-Christian idea. That's like a outsider figure that's from the Christian world. Because the truth is, when we discuss witchcraft, there is inherently kind of a Christian syncretism going on, because so much of the literature on witchcraft, like the entire idea of the witch's Sabbath, comes from Christian sources, and it's not even mainstream Christian sources. I do want to put that out there. A lot of anti-witch writing was not from the Catholic Church. It was from people in Scotland who were witch hunting, who wrote textbooks about how to witch hunt. They're not really the church itself. I mean, some of it was, but a lot of this really specific lore, the ones that get really specific, where they're and the witches would meet on Thursday the 17th on this mountain in Germany, that's witch hunting material that's not even often written by priests or anything. It's people who devoted their lives to hunting witches wrote a lot of that material, and that material has had an impact on a lot of people. And so, are paganism and witchcraft the same thing? No. Now, should they be correlated? Should they be connected? What do I think about this conversation? I think witchcraft and paganism are not the same thing, and I think we should stop calling them the same thing. But to claim there's no overlap or there's no connection is obviously silly. There obviously is a connection, and I think even a lot of the Reconstructionists would agree on this point. Now, what should we define witch as a community? I think we should return to the ancient definition. I think not all magic is witchcraft, and defining all magic as witchcraft is incorrect. It bothers me because I'm particular, and I think it's a misuse of the term. A lot of things that get called witchcraft are just not witchcraft. Like, a lot of it is invoking gods. That's mysticism. A lot of it is like ceremonial rituals. That's ceremonial magic. That's not witchcraft. A lot of it is herbal stuff. That's magia naturalis. If it's planetary magic, once again, magia naturalis, maybe theurgy. A lot of this stuff isn't witchcraft. Witchcraft is a very specific set of practices that really do lean into ideas of transgression. Because fundamentally, witchcraft was magic that is not divine magic. It was somewhat illicit, and inherently it has an element of transgression to it. If you are doing witchcraft, you must be transgressing, and people who call themselves traditional witches do agree with me on this. So, I think this is a very complicated conversation. I think this is not a conversation that can be summed up in one sentence. I might give this video some really snappy one-sentence title, because I must appease the algorithm god too. I hope this was helpful, and I hope this cleared things up. I think a lot of people who are new and even older are kind of confused on this topic, so hopefully this illuminates things for you. This has been your host, Georgina Rose. You can find me everywhere. I'm currently running a trip to India with Trove Trip. We have discounted slots, so you should check it out and come to India with me. It's going to be super fun. We're going to go on an esoteric pilgrimage, and I'm just so excited. I also host the Postmodern Iconoclast, which you can listen to on this YouTube channel. You don't need to go anywhere. It also is on most podcasting platforms, and I myself am on Instagram, TikTok, Telegram, Twitter, Threads. I'm on every platform. There's really nowhere I'm not. And if you want to support these videos and keep them coming, please join my Patreon. On my Patreon, you get an extra video every month. You get a ritual guide every single month, which are a bunch of rituals that I have created that you can follow through. They're like step-by-step instructions. And if you're a high enough tier, you can meet with me for mentoring. I also sell tarot readings. Information on how to book is in the description. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you ring the bell and do all that, after 93 days, you'll meet your holy guardian angel, and you'll never need to know these differences again, and that totally works. It's totally not just a sign out. All right, have an amazing day, night, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye.